Welcome to How the Pod. My name is Heidi Harman. This is the place where we pick the brains of changemakers about tech and society. So this episode is in partnership with progressdata.io, a research-based tool for HR managers to measure what matters when it comes to gender and diversity, pay gap, and creating parity reports with actionable improvement suggestions. That's progressdata.io. So today we're going to be speaking with Josef Conning, who's got an M.Sc in cognitive science. He started his career as a UX researcher and has now moved over to insights and foresights within the urbanist space. And so I met Josef at a very good friend's birthday party, and we connected over Jane Jacobs' book of The Death and Life of American Cities, nerding into how pavements have a specific role in the city. And already then I was like, I want to do a podcast with Josef about this. I want to sit on the amphitheater of this man's brain and share it with all of you. So Josef has worked on reshaping some of the most unloved spaces in Stockholm to bring them straight into our hearts, making them a vibrant part of the city with his urbanist research practices. And of course, Josef is a vital part of Stockholm's speakers, thinkers, and doers, serving as the TEDx community's senior advisory board. But he's also facilitating and curating a lot of the urbanist conversations with some of the leading PhDs in architecture today. A big warm welcome to you, Josef, to How the Pod. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. It's always great to be with you. I always enjoy our conversations as well. And we always get into these really interesting discussions about cities and life in cities whenever we meet. So it's my pleasure to be here, really.
So could you tell me a bit about how has your role evolved from starting off as a UX researcher, moving into insights and foresight as an urbanist?
Yeah, so right after university, I started working with digital services and user experience or service design, as it's called nowadays, I guess. And I coming from a cognitive science background, I was really interested in how people behave in complex systems and interact with technology. And so that was a good fit for me. But after a while, I felt that something was missing. I had like wider interests, and I wanted to work with societal issues and societal shifts on a broader scale. So then I found Augur, the company I work for now. I kind of randomly found them and I or ran into them, and I started to work there with a wider range of projects, essentially, not only designing digital services. And you mentioned that I moved from UX into urbanism, and I've always been really interested in cities and how cities work. But since I don't really have a background in urban planning or architecture or anything like that, I didn't really think I could work with that. I just saw it as an interest, something that I would sort of spend time on my outside of work, on my spare time. But after a while, I noticed, or I got a couple of projects in that field, and I noticed that this is something I know, because going back to this amazing book that you mentioned by Jane Jacobs, I've read so much about this, from Jane Jacobs to Gehl, Richard Florida, Edward Glaeser, and others, because just out of sheer interest. So, I noticed that I do know a little bit about this, and I have something to contribute with. And there are a lot of tools from my sort of previous life as an UX person that I can apply, in urbanism as well. So that was kind of how I got into that field, really.
So what was your first assignment within urbanism?
Yeah, so the first project I did in that field, I think, was for a global infrastructure company, and I did this report for them because they publish a lot of thought leadership reports, and I co-wrote a report for them about intercity collaborations and how cities can utilize ICT activities and strategies. Essentially.
So that would be like moving from the digital into the physical space.
Right.
So which methods do you use do you use the same tools, or does it differ in any way?
So it does differ a little bit, actually. Sometimes I'm doing projects on different levels. Sometimes it's about making a particular place, like a square or a block, as good as possible for the people living there or hanging out there. And it's quite tangible, and it's limited to a particular place in the city. But sometimes I write more high-level reports on, for instance, major shifts or trends in cities. And when it comes to designing urban spaces, for me, the part I contribute with is mostly about, involving the right people. So it's about finding out who we are designing the cities or the places for, and involving them and understanding, doing the research to understand their drivers, behaviors, needs, expectations, goals, etc. And in doing that, I do a lot of interviews with people, both individually and in groups. I walk around with people in those particular places often, interviewing them while we're walking around there. Or in the case when we're doing high-level reports, thought leadership or trend reports, it's more about understanding who the relevant, forward-looking, thought-pushing voices, experts are, and trying to essentially score interviews with them and pick their brains about what they see as important shifts and trends. So essentially, I interview people. That's my sort of go-to tool, I guess.
Yeah. So working with urbanism, as opposed to more digital services, who might the shift in clients be?
So typically, clients for me, in my case, clients include real estate companies, construction companies, infrastructure companies, and municipalities. I've done a couple of projects for government agencies as well, like state level. But usually it's from the private sector, so it's usually real estate companies and infrastructure construction companies.
So for the people who don't know what an infrastructure company is, or what they do? Would you just give them a brief overview?
Sure. It's usually they are very tech-oriented, and they actually both they work both with like digital or connectivity-related issues, or like Ericsson, for instance, or more physical space oriented, but in most cases I would say it's like real estate companies developing places and properties.
So that could, for example, be Brunkebergstorg, which I know that you worked on.
Right. Yeah, and in that case we worked with one of the real estate companies having a lot of property there, and they essentially they have the entire block in that particular case. So yeah.
And that went from like a rather tired and unpopular part of the city, central city, with a lot of issues of, it was just a mishandled piece of land or a space that was not very loved.
Absolutely.
And it went to being a phenomenal meeting place where really cool new ways of using spaces became a given place to be, and where you actually wanted to be.
Yeah, I think that was that was a successful project for them. I was involved in the beginning of that project, doing some vision work and conceptual work for that place. Urban Escape, as the block is called now, and that was super interesting, really, and. Going from a place with a very troubled legacy, mainly associated with like drugs, prostitution around Brunkebergstorg and Malmskillnadsgatan, to this, as you say, very social, open, nice place that it is today. I think that's an amazing journey that they managed to do, and I think they have. They could improve it a little bit more. I think they aren't entirely there yet, I would say, because still I don't think Brunkebergstorg is really it doesn't live up to its potential yet in terms of a social, meeting place for meetings and social interaction, but this year has been hard, obviously, in that regard. You can't really work with social interaction and meeting places or places for where people can meet. But hopefully next year they can do a little bit more in that regard.
Yeah, and just for the timestamp, for the sake of this blog, it's 2020. Today is September.
Right.
This is the year of Corona, where everything switched up, changed everything, and everything how we saw the world and how we could interact.
Right.
So you're saying that they're not quite there yet, and that there's always space for a little bit more improvement, and rightfully so. And this makes me think that you mentioned that one of the differences working from digital spaces to physical spaces is usually the projects are longer and there's so many more phases. How could you, or how could one as an urbanist or as a client of an urbanist make sure to ensure that there's quality in a larger process like that with probably a multiple of stakeholders?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question, but I don't know if there's a good answer to it. Maybe there is, but I don't really know it. It is very tricky, obviously, because there are, as you say, there are so many different stakeholders. The processes are very long. For instance, I'm starting a project this week, actually, like setting a vision and a concept for an area in the southern part of Stockholm, a part of Hammarby Sjöstad, and we're doing this now, but they will start construction in that area in 2026, and best case, I think it will be done by 2027. So that is 7 years from now, and who knows what the world will look like in 7 years, right? It is tricky, obviously, to ensure high quality throughout, that time frame, with a lot of different stakeholders coming in, and you don't really know from the outset who that will be, even. So, it is tricky. But all that being said, I think it's crucial, at least to increase your chances of being successful in the end. I think it's really crucial to keep the end users of that particular place in mind at all times. So you have to have a clear vision about what you want to do, and for whom, essentially, and keep that in mind, and make sure that every stakeholder that will come in throughout these, like in this case, 7 years, will keep that in mind, and really understand who they are doing this for and why. Yeah, and then it's really interesting to think about what quality and success is in urbanism, by which metrics we measure success and quality. I don't know, jag börjar om. And another thing is that it's really interesting to think about what quality and success really is in urbanism, by which metrics we measure success and quality. And I mean, to me, I like to use the saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So essentially, when everything is said and done, we have to look at how people relate to and use a place that we design and build. If it's a public square, for instance, we need to see if people, like being there, if they feel safe when they are there, if, they have reasons to come there, if they can be social, if the place is inclusive, factors like that we need to look at when it's, when we are done. And I think that should be the way we measure success, to me, at least, as an urbanist.
So how do you design something that's meant to stand and withhold time, let's say 100 years?
Yeah, that is a great question. And obviously, I mean, the mere thought of doing that is daunting. But I think the key to long-term planning is to allow for flexibility and change. I can imagine in the past that, the thinking has been to build as solid and robust as possible in order to ensure, long-lasting places. But now when we're thinking long-term, I think we are more inclined to think about, flexibility and the ability to repurpose places or buildings or whatever. So we can, we understand now that we need to be able to adapt places to shifting needs over time, because we really understand now that things change all the time and very rapidly. So I think planning for the unplanned is really important. And there's this great quote plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I think that's really true. You have to, when you plan things, you have to think things through really carefully, and I think that's very important. You have to really consider all aspects, or all the things happening in the world that's relevant to what you're doing. However, the plans you're making, the pieces of paper where it says, we're going to do this, that will for sure change. That will be relevant for a very limited period of time. But the planning part of that is super important. You have to, look at things from different views and really assess things.
So I know that you've mentioned that the idea and construction of ABC cities, which I'm going to, maybe you can fill in for people who don't know what that is, that was at the time, during its formation, it was super modern. And today we look back at it, what is it, like 80 years later, we're like, oh my God, that was a huge mistake. I might even be wrong about the times. But do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really interesting because, as you said, it was very modern and progressive at the time. And I think parts of the thinking is really good because they try to create these mixed use areas, essentially, where people could both live, work, and hang out, and shop and do other stuff, and which is really good. And I do believe in like multi-centric cities. I think that's a really good idea. I think the problem, or one of the problems with ABC-städer, as we call them in Swedish.
What would that translate to in English?
Well, cities or centers, urban centers for working, living, and I don't know, hanging out / shopping, I guess.
What is the C in Swedish?
Centrum.
Okay, so yeah.
And the traditional centrum, like Vällingby Centrum, for instance,
right.
which is a place for shopping, essentially, and having coffee. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And right. So yeah. I think to some extent they had a good idea, but one of the problems was that these cities became, or these centers became, quite remote. Like Vällingby, for instance. They are sort of spread out, so they become like satellite cities, which isn't that good. I think if they had developed this more densely and place these ABC-städer closer to like the center of Stockholm, I think that would have been better, probably. Because then the city could have grown more organically, and So I think to some extent that was a really good idea, but there were some flaws to how they implemented it.
So is there any way we could avoid mistakes like ABC cities, even with foresight? I mean, do we have a chance? Because I'm imagining that, of course, with the time, I mean, there's no guarantees that people won't think that we are bananas in 80 years.
Well, I would say yes and no, actually. We do learn from our previous mistakes, and we kind of learn what we shouldn't do, what doesn't work. But obviously we will make new mistakes instead, and I mean, that's perfectly fine. However extensive our knowledge is, when it comes to cities and urban planning, there are no guarantees. In 15 or in 50 years, people might look back at us and think we were crazy. I think we now know one way of keeping the risk of making mistakes down a little bit, at least. We do more and more research in urban planning. We use more participatory and democratic design processes. And, back in the days when ABC Stadar, when that was all the rage, urban planning was a very, it was a man's game, essentially. Urban planning was something that, older white men did, and cities were planned, by and for men in general. And that is something we have moved away from, thankfully. So now we are more inclusive, we are more participatory in our design process, meaning that we are probably less likely to make some fundamental mistakes. But again, I really think we will make mistakes, and a lot of things we do today will be looked back on as bananas for sure. But I probably that's that is how it's always gonna be. So we can't really avoid that completely. I would say.
Having lived in Stockholm, New York, London, and San Francisco, I have spoken, observed, photographed, and also Tokyo. I mean, I haven't lived there, but I have observed and taken a lot of pictures of staircases. And in Japan, they always build this little rail for your bike so that you don't have to carry your bike over a staircase.
Right.
And something that's really specific to Sweden and definitely stands out, and I think it's the human-centric way of thinking about cities and humans and women or caretakers, is that every staircase has these two little ramps for a pram. So if you're actually a caretaker in Stockholm, you can push your pram.
Right.
You can take the subway, which is a very loved way of transport in Stockholm, because most people in Stockholm don't have a car. It's basically a small city. You do use the public transport a lot, maybe not right now, but anyway, as opposed to London, where if you're lucky, there might be an elevator. And then the same thing goes for, maybe in San Francisco, they'll have a rail for a bike on a staircase next to the escalator. But that is one of the things that when I have caretaker friends who come to Stockholm, they're like, oh my God, this actually works.
Right.
Just an observation.
Yeah. And I think you're pointing to something really interesting and also important, I think, for cities like Stockholm and Scandinavian cities in general. It's all relative, of course, but I think compared to many other cities in the world, I think Scandinavian cities are very human-centric and human scale. Obviously, there are a lot of things we need to fix here and in the other Scandinavian cities as well. But I think we are actually, I'm not saying that this just because I'm a Stockholmer, but I think that Scandinavian cities, we are at the forefront in many aspects. A while ago, people started to look at Copenhagen and this notion Copenhagenize was coined, predominantly, I think, thanks to Gehl, the urban planner from Denmark, from Copenhagen. And cities around the world started talking about that, we want to Copenhagenize our cities, and meaning that we want to make our city more, human-centric, human scale. And I think that we have been comparing urbanism with like UX and service design a little bit. And I think, in the digital world, Silicon Valley has been sort of the epicenter or whatever. I think actually that Scandinavia is really the corresponding thing in urbanism, where many cities look at, probably mainly Copenhagen, because they have done so many things right, in terms of like the infrastructure for bikes or
amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've lived there.
Yeah.
The only other city that comes close. I mean, Stockholm is okay,
Right.
but oh my God, San Francisco.
Right.
But Denmark is, I mean, they're light years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and for pedestrians as well. And so it's I think that is. I mean, it is easy to be critical or to be frustrated with urban planning in Stockholm, but I mean, we do a lot of things right for sure.
Yeah. So, what would be a third example of Copenhagenism if one is pedestrian, 2 is bike lanes? What could an example of 3 be?
One thing that's really crucial in that mix is the culture. I think it's kind of it's a liberal culture in many ways. I mean, they do have issues, obviously, with non-liberal movements, to put it mildly. But there's a very open, tolerant, liberal culture, which I think is really good for urban life, for city life, for the sort of climate in the city, I think that is one thing we have here as well, to a great extent, and in many other cities scoring high on livability, etc., like Amsterdam, for instance. I think that's one key part of it. It's just my opinion, but still, I think a lot of cities that provide a great vibrant city life or urban culture, they have that in common, and I think it's a crucial part.
So, okay, question on citizen participation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can if the planners want to include city participators or users of the city in their research, even if there's not a plan going on in your immediate environment that you could potentially take part of, and you just think, oh, I would like this to be different. Let's say maybe you live in a suburb with issues, whatever that might be. What are the ways for a single citizen to impact their surroundings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in general people can be more engaged in their local communities, and I think that is a strong trend that we see now in many cities. Stockholm, for instance, that people take their own initiatives and start things and do things like in their neighborhoods or whatever. And I strongly believe in this bottom-up urbanism or guerrilla urbanism or whatever you call it. But I think that it's good that people are more involved and engaged in and committed to improving their own local neighborhoods. And I think in many areas of society today, we see this shift from top down to bottom up, and we've done tons of research in various fields where we've seen this theme, essentially. So, and I see it in urbanism as well, and I think it's I believe that is a good thing, actually, and especially in Sweden, I think we've had a culture here, where we've sort of expected someone else, some public agency or the municipality, to sort of take responsibility and do things around us for us. But now it seems to me that we are, taking more responsibility ourselves, and we improve the neighborhoods around us, on our own accord, essentially. And I think that's good. And I think in general, citizen participation in urban design is becoming increasingly common. And I think also that, like, municipalities and landowners and real estate companies, they are becoming more aware of the benefits of this approach, and I think they realize that they will have a better, relation with citizens if they involve them. So to them, they see the both social and societal benefits, but also to them, the economical benefits, I think. I think this is something that's becoming more and more common, and I mean, more can be done, obviously, but from the citizens, to go back to your question, from the citizens' perspective, I think it's possible it's easier nowadays to actually do your own things and take initiative and gather people around you to actually create change. It's easier now than ever before, at least.
What would an example of that be?
Yeah, so for instance, every now and then we see people setting up like micro parks, for instance, in Stockholm. There is
for growing greens, for example.
Yeah, exactly. For creating these green places, like green oases in cities. We have this quite famous example from Södermalm. It's a while ago, actually, now, but it's a group of people wanted to create this micro park outside of Victoria, the theater on Åsegatan.
Oh yeah, that's
yeah. So it's near where you live, right? So so they gathered like people working in that, living and working in that area, and shop owners, and they tried to create this micro park, and eventually they succeeded. It was really, really hard, actually, because there's a lot of bureaucracy.
Is that the one when they like paved the entire Götgatan with like greens and benches? No.
Or
was it on that little extra strip?
This is like, Åsegatan, where Åsegatan hits Götgatan outside of Victoriabiografen.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like a parking spot, I guess. For cars.
That one. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good example, because the bureaucracy is really crazy, so they had to sell this to the municipality as a religious event eventually, and that was the only way to make it happen, actually. That was obviously totally non-religious, because they only wanted to make a micropark where people could, sit down. There were some plants. People could sit there, have coffee, and I mean, this was a couple of square meters, so not a very big place or anything, but it took them such a long time to make this happen, because the bureaucracy is crazy.
That is persistence.
Yeah, really. But I think people have that drive, and although it took many years to do this, or a long time at least to do this, they did, they persisted, and they had that drive, and they really wanted to do it. So, I think that's a good example. And also near Skanstull, people started these urban farming projects, odlingar på spåren, I think, yeah.
Just for the English translation, there's like an old railway that's not being used. So just above the water, on the railway, they set up their little squares of growing edibles.
Right. And I think they still do that today, actually.
Oh,
yeah. And so there are like local initiatives, popping up every here and there. And I think that's really important, because I think that that improves urban life so much. So I think that is really important. And I think that is something, I mean, instead of, creating a lot of obstacles and barriers, I think municipalities should, find ways to support people instead.
Yeah. And are there any differences between large cities and, let's say, a less urban part of the land?
In regards to anything in particular?
In regards to, I know that we've discussed this before, but for example, because the municipality, if you say like, oh, I would like to plant a few boxes of edibles here, they will literally deliver those to you with the soil, with the seeds, with everything, and say, here you go. Go create magic. And that is, that's our tax money. We're actually allowed to do that.
Yeah.
I know that you were mentioning something about that when we were having our research talk.
Right. I think maybe, I don't know for sure either, but I do think that sometimes smaller cities can be more easier to collaborate with as a citizen. They are probably, in some cases, they are more likely to accommodate your initiatives or the things you want to do. In Stockholm, I think it's slightly more conservative, and there are a lot of really strong conservative forces in Stockholm, trying to keep the city as is at all times, and trying not to change it too much, and we talk about Nimbyism in urban planning, meaning people. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, essentially meaning people that don't really want things to be built or changed near where they are, where they live, for instance. That's a strong force in Stockholm, and I think in some smaller cities that force isn't as strong as here. And some smaller cities, I think, are more. They are more. They realize that they have to change, and they have to, be progressive to attract new people. I think it's a little bit. There are some similarities here, probably, with companies. Really big companies tend to stagnate a little bit and be, a little bit more change averse, I guess. But smaller companies are more flexible, more, open to changes, So I think probably this is the case with bigger versus smaller cities as well. Then I know I come from a tiny town, and I know that town can be really conservative, and I know there are a lot of smaller cities that won't change, of course. But if we speaking more broadly or in general, I think you're pointing to you're making a good point, really.
And so I have questions about the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Will we redesign cities due to this, or the spaces that we can use, avoiding being inside? Are there, the stock for the real estate market has basically gone down pretty much and is like the one that hasn't gone up again. I'm guessing that it's hard to rent out spaces. Are they going to rebuild it into housing? Are we going to do we see a rezoning of offices into habitable spaces? I know it's a broad question, but what are your thoughts?
So I've seen in many cities, they have repurposed streets. So instead of having streets for, cars, they have turned those streets into bike lanes and zones for pedestrians. So they have, they can move around with more distance between them. And I think that's a really good thing. And I hope that is something that will stick after this pandemic. Obviously, the situation we're in now is temporary, but so I think we will go back to to a great extent. We will probably go back to how things were before. But this is one thing that I really hope cities will kind of keep or stick to. How they have repurposed areas so people can move around more easily and more, move around in the open air more, making it easier to walk or bike to work or to wherever you're going. And hopefully that is one change, one positive change that will come out of the pandemic.
And now as another factor that's, painfully unavoidable is the California fires. Australia's was burning not too long ago at the same time. We're increasingly noticing that, climate is real. Mm-hmm. I think we're all convinced of that before, but I think it's inevitable for a lot of politicians.
Unfortunately, not all of us, but most of us was aware. But some people, unfortunately, in power weren't aware.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
But are we going to change how we design cities?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are at least two levels of this. And I think we're redesigning cities now as a direct response to things happening because of climate change. But I think also, like in the long term, we're sort of thinking differently about this, how to develop and build cities. So, for example, in New York on Manhattan, Bjarke Ingels, the Danish architect, is building something they call the dry line, So it's essentially a protective wall that protects the city from rising sea levels, because during Sandy, I think, sea levels were rising, and a lot of people were affected, and also a lot of buildings were affected. So that that led to a lot of destruction and damage, and I think that type of response is becoming more common. Where we realize that we have to build defense systems essentially from storms and rising sea levels, and that is like a direct response to this change. And in the long term, I think we are thinking about using more sustainable materials. We're building buildings, even high rises, in using like wood constructions now, and that is much better than like metal or concrete. So yeah, I think there are a lot of things happening that we will probably see long-term effects of as well. And also we talked about urban farming before. I think that is something we do more in cities now, making sure we can grow things in the cities where we actually consume those products. Instead of growing things out in the countryside and having things, shipped into the cities, with trucks, we grow them here and we consume them here. So that is also one aspect of how we, design cities now, in a way that's more aware of our, how we affect the climate. Another thing is the transport system. In public transport, for instance, many cities are working with making public transport more accessible and a more viable option for people, so they don't have to use their own cars. And there's a lot of sharing models for cars, so people that used to own a car, perhaps they don't have to anymore. And also there's a strong electrification trend in the mobility sector. So we have a lot of electric modes of transportation now, both micromobility and electric cars and buses, obviously.
And is there any way that we can make cities smarter? And what would like a smart city be, if we were to define it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because smart cities is something a lot of people talk about now, and I think it's really interesting to talk about what a smart city really is, and I mentioned Gehl before, and he talks about this all the time. When it comes to smart cities, we have to focus on the people living in cities, and it's all about them, what they do and how they live their lives, and I think it's important to focus on the end goal, and which to me at least is to make cities more sustainable and livable and lovable, and smart cities in regards to the infrastructure, which is what people usually talk about, like connectivity, 5G, the technical aspect of smart cities. I think that's, obviously that's important, but that shouldn't be like the starting point in the discussion. The starting point should be how cities can be more sustainable and livable and lovable. And I think that with the technology we have today, there's a lot of potential to making cities more sustainable and livable. Obviously, I mean it's great that traffic planning, energy consumption, or energy production, or the logistics system, or like maintenance can run more efficiently, and we can make the city more sustainable in that way. That is amazing, but the focus should be, how does this benefit the people living in the city? And in that regard, I think it's important to be mindful that smart cities tend to gather a lot of information about citizens, and we have smart cities tend to have a very granular sensory system, picking up a lot of data about citizens, what they do, how they move around, etc. And we need to be mindful of how we use that information and who can access that. And this issue has been very apparent in a project in Toronto. Actually, that project was shut down in May this year, but the Google company Sidewalk Labs had this development project up until May this year in Toronto, where they wanted to create this smart city as a part of Toronto. And that was really interesting. They had a fantastic master plan, and they did so many amazing things. Very, sustainable, very both what I would consider to be livable and lovable. But they weren't very transparent with how they would use all the information they would gather. That became a very infected discussion and debate in Toronto. And there's this brilliant open government advocate called Bianca Wiley, and she voiced these concerns and took this fight with Google or Sidewalk Labs, essentially taking having a fight with a company that big with Google behind them is not easy, but she did that, and they were forced to be more transparent and share their plans more, for how they would use all this information. And I think that was really good, actually, and that discussion is very important to have now, before we sort of move in to another era of smart cities. And eventually they stopped development. I think that was mostly because of the pandemic, not the discussion about data. But anyway, I think that's a good example of this. And just to answer your question, I think smart cities essentially is a good thing, as long as the end goal and the focus is sustainability and making cities better for the people living there. But still, you have to be mindful, I would say.
And what can citizens do for themselves if they want to improve their local planning of their spaces?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit before. I think they can be more, engaged in their local communities, and I think people really should. And there are a lot of initiatives in most communities or neighborhoods in and around Stockholm, for instance. And if you have a good idea, run with it and try to get people on board and if it's something that will improve your neighborhood, it's amazing. And at the same time, I'm all for bottom-up urbanism. I think that's a great shift, actually, but at the same time, there has to be, some level of top-down, control. I guess is the best word for it. And that is obviously a sort of a political layer. So obviously, as a citizen, you can get more politically involved, and you can try to change things that way. I think it's also important to remember that again, although I'm all for taking your own initiatives and doing things to improve your neighborhoods, very hands-on, fast. I really like that, but at the same time, in all these urban planning processes, there's that is a political process, and there is a built-in inertia to avoid things happening too fast. And although that is really, really frustrating a lot of times, I think there's there's a value in that. We have to have those sort of obstacles or barriers to some extent, because we don't really want someone making like mindless decisions without other people
being able to impact and
exactly
collaborate.
Right, exactly, because that could have like really dangerous effects. And we do have this separation of powers for a reason, right? We need, the checks and balances to make sure that the things we do are, sensible, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think it's good if you, do fun things in your neighborhood, but also, you have to be patient, and you have to, follow processes to some extent, I guess. And I think also one thing that's really important, especially in Stockholm, I think we talked about Copenhagen before, and I think they do this a little bit better, actually. But one thing that I hope that we get better at is using gamification as a part of urban planning. And I think this bottom-up shift is actually good for that, because when people are working and doing things in their neighborhoods and improving their the streets they use every day, the places they go to every day and spend time in every day, I think they will find it's easier for them to find ways that makes the sort of urban space more fun to be in. And I think that's a good tool, actually, gamification.
And what would an example of gamifying your surroundings be?
Yeah, so there are a lot of examples actually from... actually, there's one good example from Stockholm, and that was, I think, part of an ad campaign, actually, for a company. Maybe you remember the Odenplan subway station. Yeah, with the stairs, they... each step of the stair, they turned into a like piano key, right? So when people were walking up the stairs... a melody was playing like from the keys, and people would like stop there and play in the stairs with these piano keys, and that was really interesting. And people were starting taking the stairs instead of the escalator. So that was also like a public health thing, and I think this was actually like an example or a case to show that you can affect people's behavior by making things more fun, essentially. And this is something obviously that we can do in larger scale.
That's a wonderful example. I think on that note, we need to start rounding off.
Sure.
Josef, thank you ever so much for joining me in this conversation, and thanks for getting a sneak peek into your brain and how you think about the world. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
So I would like to say thank you to Helio. It's been a pleasure. They've been hosting us in their podcast studio. It is an amazing meeting place. They have meeting rooms. It's stunningly beautiful. Beautiful Swedish design. We've got amazing service. They're kind. It's super central. They have a location in Grevetorgatan 30, but also in 6 other locations around Stockholm. If you need a meeting room for a business meeting, that is where I would suggest you to look. A big thank you to helio.se.